Yeah, hello everyone. I haven't been making any videos for quite a while because I published my first book and my second book is also in the making. But now that I'm going to write more articles, I would like to inform people what I'm doing. And recently I published an article on this famous person here, and his name is Wilhelm Dilthey, a German philosopher who actually discovered something that is history. Of course, the first philosopher of history was probably Hegel. And you may say, how did they discover history? I mean, they had history before. Well, I think before they thought history is just a series of events and it does not impact so much the attitudes of people towards each other. And especially, it does not affect so much our reasoning about the world. And that was especially seen in the 17th century, 18th century, when philosophers of Enlightenment tried to formulate the perfected form of reasoning that was independent from history. But Wilhelm Dilthey is somebody who claims that our logical reasoning actually depends on the historical conditions of our time. So he says what man is, only his history tells. Now, of course, that immediately brings us to the question of relativism, yeah, something that we personally believes within the confines of historical limitations. And a lot of philosophers actually fear that kind of relativism. And also Dilthey is a part of this movement or a part of this general fear of relativism. Yeah, in this regard, I have actually written a paper that I recently uploaded on academia.edu, and I call that the fear of relativism, Dilthey's theory of worldviews between historicism and ahistoricity. And if we look here, right in the abstract, we see what is my thesis. I just want to read that very quickly. So I believe that Dilthey develops a theory of worldviews. I believe the term comes from him. It's like a Weltsicht, or how do you say that in German? Worldview, Weltansicht. Yeah, I believe. So, and the idea is that we have different angles of how we look at the world, and this actually determines our view. So, for Dilthey, it's on the one hand a materialist perspective, on the other and a more theological perspective, and then the overcoming of these kind of synthesis that is probably something like objective idealism or philosophy of freedom. That is what we have to look closer into, because indeed he wants to escape the idea of relativism. I hold that historical relativism is a valuable position in philosophy, but Dilthey reverts to an unsuccessful ahistorical solution because he fears relativism. And that is technically what I will explore. Now, you may immediately say relativism, like that's a view that is self-contradictory. It's the belief that truth is not absolute but varies from culture to culture and from person to person, or from historical to historical moment. However, at the same time, I maintain the idea that it's absolute, that there is no absolute truth. I claim there's no truth. In other words, I claim that it's absolutely true that there is no truth. And that's a so-called performative self-contradiction, namely claiming true that there is no truth. The performance contradicts the content of the performance, the content of the statement embedded in the performance. A lot of people, they also then invoke another argument when a self-proclaimed moral relativist chastises you for being wrong. A moral relativist cannot say anymore that anything is wrong because anything goes. And of course, these are very simple views, I believe. We have some arguments regarding this. So in the article, I write that relativism is the big boogaboo that has to be defeated at all costs. And throughout history, dating back to Plato, there has been the prevailing belief that relativism, especially in its so-called globalistic form, that is saying that there is no truth, right? It's self-contradictory and incapable of establishing any objective knowledge. And it is interesting because people who may be not familiar with philosophy, but also philosophers, they think that that is a defeating argument. But what, for example, Benningsen says, that the common characteristic of the objections against relativism is their brevity. So usually they allude to an immediate self-contradiction, and then we see that like these historical epistemologies are never really defended by philosophers. So I want to talk a little bit about these self-contradictions, because obviously somebody who's committed to relativism will be aware of these self-contradictions. Now, we have different arguments that are more or less understand. So we have semantic versus pragmatic self-contradiction. So there we say that the relativist is not necessarily asserting a universal truth, but making a contextual or expressive move. Saying there is no absolute truth is not self-contradictory if interpreted pragmatically. So I just say that in pragmatic contexts, when we discuss each other, it's just very useless to claim that there's an absolute truth. We always have to have a discourse of what we commonly accept as truth. So in this kind of context, I say, don't come with absolute truths. You may have an argument for that, which I don't understand, but I'm still willing to discuss with you. Now, if I then claim there are no absolute truths, then it's more kind of a claim that I say there are no absolute truths that can be simply defended in a pragmatic discourse that we have. And maybe there are absolute truths, but I have at that moment no insight into them and nobody could explain it to me. So maybe we should retreat to a relativist position and discuss that on a relativist lane. And you may say, no, yeah, but if you say there's no truth, then how can you have a discussion? Well, let me give you an example. When we play chess, we have the option of either playing d4 or we play e4. Now, right now, because chess is such a complex game, it is unclear whether e4 or d4 is better. Now, let's say, just hypothetically, that only one of them will lead to a necessary and forced win of white. Maybe both of them will be a draw, but let's just assume that one of them will lead to a win. And this needs such a complex calculation that there is an absolute truth, but we cannot assess it. And now, does that mean that we can have no knowledge about whether we want to play e4 or d4? Maybe we can even have a theory where we say it's better to play e4 or d4. Now, we don't even have to consider e4 or d4. We can also say playing something like a4. Now, a4 to most chess players looks absurd, but there are also openings. And maybe that's the true solution to the game of chess, because that creates kind of a disbalance that white then can exploit first. Now, our standard theory goes towards the idea that occupying the center must be the best way to play it. But we simply don't know. However, we don't know it in an absolute sense. We know it in a relativist sense, that according to the games that have been played amongst very good players, e4 or d4 usually proves to be better with regard to the limited knowledge we generate. In other words, we generate knowledge even though right now we don't have absolute knowledge and we don't play chess in an absolutely true way. So I think this is one of the arguments. And so we can look at some more claims. They all go on a different level, like go on a similar lane. Like we have like the meta level, we have deflationary theories of truth. We don't have to go through that like now in all detail. Nevertheless, I'm not completely satisfied with it. So also when we have, for example, a deflationary theory of truth, we say that we are not claiming that it's true as P, we just claim P. And then we don't have like the contradiction between absolute or relative anymore, but we have a discussion of whether the claim is meaningful or not. And in that sense, we can still accept relative truths. We say, okay, if P is true in our limited context, then do we have relative truths? And that is probably what a relativist argues for. We can have meaningful discourses even though we don't have absolute truths. And I think that is what it is all about. So if you hear somebody arguing against absolute truths, you can make a little investigation, but you don't have to immediately completely dismiss that claim. Now, however, Dilthey looks a little bit different at that, right? At his 70th birthday, he says that a critique of historical reason is almost accomplished. Not yet. So he wants to transform the ahistorical framework of Kant to a historical framework. But he is still afraid that we still need a universally valid form of cognition and thinking, because otherwise we would come to an anarchy of convictions. Now, I don't see that in chess. We don't have the absolute valid form of chess, maybe, but we have accepted ways of how we think about it, and we still have certain theories of what we should do. Now, Dilthey is here afraid of anarchy, and he then says, if I fall by the wayside, I hope that all my younger colleagues, my students, will follow it to the end. He then develops a particular theory that I won't discuss in this video here. I will discuss it in a second part, a theory of worldviews, which is incredibly interesting. And I do think that it could contribute to a more relativist theory of how we generate knowledge. But unfortunately, he doesn't follow through with it. And he still tries to develop an absolute framework, which then is contradictory to the method that he develops. If you're interested in these arguments, I will post the link below for that article. Please leave a comment. Are you a relativist? Do you say there are absolute truths and you know these absolute truths? Then inform me. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe there are absolute truths, right? So maybe you can inform me about your absolute truths. And I want to make one last point. I'm actually not a relativist in the sense that I say there is no truth. I don't think I have anything to say about that. Maybe there is truth, but I'm more like a historical relativist, saying that up to this moment, by all the arguments that I've studied, I've neither seen a proof of God that works, although they can be very smart, and I also have not seen any proof that gives us a universally valid form of knowledge, universally in the sense that it is true, independent from the historical moment and for all time. I haven't seen a convincing argument for that. Therefore, I have a kind of historical relativism that says, until this moment in history, I think there is no absolute truth. Therefore, we should revert to a relativist framework and develop systems of knowledge on our common discourse and our benevolence with regard to each other. That's a kind of historical relativism. That's what I defend. Maybe you let me know in the comments what you're thinking. Thank you very much. Live long and don't argue too harshly, and prosper.